everyone, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Anthony, for joining us as well.
Thank you.
I think we can start maybe with an introduction of the studio and when was it founded and how, and go a little bit into the...
Yeah, so is it going to work? Yeah, so Assemble sort of started relatively informally. We started through essentially two self-build projects. So the first one was the Cineroleum in 2010, and we'd graduated from a bachelor's, largely doing architecture, had come out into the world just after the kind of 2008 financial crash. Jobs are scarce, lots of sites are empty. The jobs we were getting were fairly depressing a lot of the time, and I guess there was a real feeling of trying to work together again in the way that we had done at university and at students, and a kind of optimism that happens when you're a student that exists less sometimes as a kind of lowly professional. And we found this kind of abandoned petrol station that had a housing development that had stalled because of the economy, and kind of each member put in sort of £50 of their own money and came together to kind of do this like initial self-build project where we kind of designed it, built it. So here this photo is the kind of mass production of new chairs for the cinema. We programmed it, we made the uniforms, we made the signs, we chose the films, we managed it, and it was this kind of like relatively ad hoc, relatively improvised, very amateur way of I guess exploring our agency as designers in public, like I said, in quite a naive way. So this is a picture of the kind of completed installation. It was on Clerkenwell Road, which is one of the main roads through central London. Here's at night, and then yeah, the cinema itself was this kind of theatrical experience. So every night at the end, the kind of curtain would be drawn up, and the audience would be kind of thrust back out into the street. And at this point, we had no name, no real organization. It was a kind of project we're doing on the side without necessarily an idea that Assemble as a project would have any legs and come out of it.
Yep.
And then I got relatively large amount of publicity, kind of unexpected amount of publicity for that project. And we're invited to enter a competition there was a kind of series of peripheral artworks for the 2012 Olympics before the Olympics in London. And so the 𝗠ecie for a flyover was our second project, which kind of came out of that. And there were kind of £40,000 of funding for various art installations that existed around the Olympic Park while it was under construction. And it was in some ways it was a similar project. We proposed this idea of this design that was a kind of invented mythology of the nail house, the kind of house that was there before the development happened. Again, this time we were an incredibly ad hoc group. This was what we were living. A couple of us were living in this kind of big shared house. This is a kind of early meeting with the model, and a similar process of kind of building it ourselves, designing it ourselves. This kind of temporary, very immediate action. And so this was the site as found, and like I said, the design idea was this sort of invented house that existed in the middle of this kind of flyover, and ran a kind of program of like films, theatre. In the day it had a cafe, and I think was similar in style and character and approach to the previous project, but was with a bit more intent, and a bit more of I guess an argument and an idea, whereas the first one really was like a kind of essentially for fun. And the practice sort of evolved out of an enjoyment and a value in working together in a very non-hierarchical, very collaborative way, in a very immediate way, and thinking about how, I guess, as a young designer, young architect, you could try and explore your collective agency to enact change in the environment around you. I guess in a built environment which feels very static and feels very slow to change. This is an image of kind of I think it's 2001: A Space Odyssey we were showing. And then the kind of image as it was sort of during a showing.
So Sorry. So going from this idea of self-build and collaborative way, can you tell us more about like your working method when it's also like applied to client briefs or working with wider communities and how you involve those in the process?
Yeah, so I guess, so like I said, these first two projects were very much like, they were quite insular, quite inward-looking. And it was during the course of these that we sort of started talking about how actually maybe this could be an organization that could exist beyond temporary projects and could have a real existence. And then the kind of real step in cementing that was securing our own workspace. So we were offered this empty former sign painter's warehouse. The sign painter had gone bankrupt because everyone was printing them digitally. They used to do a lot of pub signs. And we sort of offered this kind of empty space for somewhere between 5 and 7 years before it was being demolished. And I guess had this idea of essentially transferring some of these things that happened just outside into this kind of shared space. So the first version, again, was this, I guess, an idea of like a public venue that our office would be kind of within. So we kind of moved the cinema into the front, the studios and workshop at the back and the front, and then the kind of cafe space in the front. Kind of put, again, similar thing, we're doing everything ourselves. We set up as a brand. Put it up the website, man the pizza ovens, but I guess, kind of organize parties. And again, it was this thing about, I guess, very much like a network through doing and through putting on events and through doing things that allowed us to kind of start generating a kind of network around us. Just kind of photo us working in the front of house. And I guess through doing that and through the kind of, I guess, started coming to an idea about a key idea about the importance of making kind of space for I guess, creative working. And the idea that actually that we'd sort of started to coalesce around a working method that was about prototyping, it was about fabricating, it was about testing things out materially, large models, and these are things that really need space. But also we really enjoyed in that process kind of with all these, like collaborating very closely with fabricators and with suppliers and with materials. And so that kind of started this kind of underpinning with this kind of beginning to do a lot of our work about making space, kind of create collective spaces. And this approach that's about, I guess, a very holistic idea about the kind of activities that come under architecture. So programming, business planning, fundraising, and then the first real project that sort of came out of that as a kind of external project was Black Horse Workshop. And this was kind of very unattractive in some ways, kind of very functional industrial building. And there was basically a pot of money. I mean, people here may not have heard about it, but there was a series of riots that happened in 2011. Again, largely due to social inequality, racism, in some ways the usual things. And there was a series of funding drives by the GLA, the Greater London Authority, to try and improve areas in outer London where a lot of these problems were. And so we pitched an idea to one of these funds for Walthamstow, so way out in East London, for, I guess, essentially like a library of tools. An idea that actually, like spaces of making, and that making is very empowering and very, that thing of like doing something with your hands, that you kind of do at school and then you sort of often, most people seem to stop. And so pitched a kind of very fun, very simple idea of like the library of tools. And then as a way of sort of proving it, built this really hokey little mobile workshop that we took into kind of shopping malls and public spaces and used it as a way of kind of trying to generate an audience that proved there was demand for this idea to then kind of make an argument at the council. And then kind of collating that in a kind of essentially a business plan that talked about the site and the architecture, talked about the funding model, the staffing model, the payment model. And again, I guess this is particularly as an example of where the architecture is very light touch. There was very little money. Most of the money went on the equipment, on the staff, but then they're still trying to, even within that kind of minimal means, there's still an aim to try and make it beautiful and careful. And it's been a huge success. So we've got kind of woodworking workshop, there's a metalworking workshop, there's private desk space, so you can hire out desks if you, and from kind of whole studios to little desks. It's kind of grown twice. So like, again, like architecturally, it's this like weird thing that it's kind of grown very organically and quite, in some ways with not a huge amount of intent as like funding has happened, it's kind of grown. But it's got to the state where now it has about, it's been running more than 10 years. It has 2,000 members. There's 60 businesses based there. And it's often used as an example, as an exemplar project when councils want to start their own things. And it's proved both in terms of getting individuals into craft, but also as a kind of incubator for people who maybe want to start their own business and come out and enable them to, before you can afford to commit to your own studio, to have something that's that little bit of leg up and that support.
And this is still run by Assemble?
It's not, no, it's a separate organization. So this is, again, an example that we, like, it was an organization we set up. We're still on the board, but it's completely its own organization with its own director, own staff, and that we're still on very good terms with, but it's like something that we've created and then kind of let go. And I think that's really important as well, that you don't kind of always have these things. And in the end, I guess, our skills isn't in the running of these spaces necessarily. The skills in the kind of creation and the design.
No.
This is the slide that was this. This was a Mirable made for its 10th birthday party. Yeah, so that's going Black Horse. And so I guess Black Horse was one of the, I guess an early project was about looking at how an idea that was very much about our way of working internally could be shared and could be made something that was, I guess, a more public and more permanent piece of kind of civic infrastructure.
And I mean, you find that this idea resonates with a lot of people that actually need to have a community space to experiment and to. But how do you first approach these communities, and what kind of tools can you give them to continue to strengthen their presence and become networks of mutual support somehow? And I mean, maybe there's another project.
I should probably, I think I've missed a project, then we should go back to that. So what I was going to say, sorry, and then come back to that question, was then we kind of took the learnings from Black Horse back into our studio space. So this is a picture from the British Craft College, which was based very near us. And we basically collaborated with a series of recent graduates who moved in and set up a kind of permanent, more functional workshop. And so I guess this was the birth of what currently Chicago Studios, where we are tenants within our own studio space, but there are lots of other tenants who the key ones bring their own kind of specialist knowledge and specialist equipment. So here we had Workshop East, who had a kind of really high spec wood mill. We had a stonemason and a kind of metalworker who and so the idea that then the studios became a set in itself, a kind of creative network within itself. So it wasn't just about us doing our own things. This was our kind of new office. Front of house kind of transitioned from being a kind of public gallery space to being something that was much more about making and doing. Do you want to?
No, I mean, my question was mainly how do you, first of all, gather these communities? Because you have a lot of creatives working around the city, but sometimes everyone is kind of isolated and they sort of are doing their own thing. So it's, first of all, how do you create this pole of attraction? And then what kind of tools do you give them to continue growing as a network of?
I think it's very different depending on the project. And I think when we get to Liverpool, we can talk about it a bit more clearly. I think a lot of it comes about by building on networks that already exist. And so I guess in different projects differently. So something like Black Horse Workshop was a kind of creation, but it was a creation that felt very much like it fitted within a hole that was there. Where other projects I'll talk about a bit later were much more about partnering with embedded organizations there. So you're not trying to start things from scratch. You're not kind of coming in as a complete outsider. Do you want me to talk about Goldsmiths, or should I try and jump to Liverpool?
No, yeah, of course. I think it's a great.
So then.
This is more of a client.
So yeah, this is I guess jumping a bit. This is then our kind of first major architectural with a kind of capital A commission. Was at this time we we won a competition, and at this point they took a huge leap with us. We'd not built any permanent work for a new gallery for 𝗏𝗏𝗆's College in London. And I think the reason why I guess I brought this up is I think it's an example of how like allowing a space like that enables us to work in maybe a slightly different way to how lots of architects were able to work. So this is kind of our large competition model. You can kind of see me hiding behind the tower in the middle with much shorter hair. And the building itself is kind of amazing. It's the plant room and the boiler house of a kind of Victorian faux Jacobean bathhouse. And for us, it was about like working very closely with the existing structure. When we started the project, you basically couldn't get between the different floors. You had to go outside, inside, because it was never set up to be a public space. And so our proposal was these kind of two new insertions, working very sectionally to kind of create these new gallery spaces, but also that created all the kind of vertical circulation space, kind of up these kind of new things. And it was, I guess, like again, very much working a kind of archaeological action within the building. And to make that understandable both to us, and then initially the kind of jury, and then later the kind of client group was working a lot with kind of large-scale physical models as a way of very like directly, representationally looking at how the designs would.
Sorry. That's an announcement of our talk.
So we've already started.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of model of the entrance space. That's how it kind of ended up being. And
here. Thank you.
Does that mean I have to start again?
Yeah, we can take it from the top.
So this is then the model we did for at the competition stage, and that's kind of the gallery in real life.
Oh.
Again, like a model that we, rather than trying to turn the cast iron like water tanks into kind of like heated, cooled spaces, we decided to kind of keep them very raw and keep them outside, because you'd kind of lose their whole character if you did that. And so this is the model of showing that tank, and this is the kind of end result. So it's this quite weird space for a gallery that's like dark and black and kind of the complete opposite to the white cube spaces next to it.
Yeah.
That I think apparently artists really enjoy because it's just very different. And so overall it's about providing like new spaces, but then using the existing spaces to give a very richness, a real variety, and like kind of almost like uncovering the history. So this is this kind of main cut in the middle of the building that we call the forum space that kind of provides this kind of new vertical link and really kind of see the kind of history of the site. Is where they do kind of public talks and things like that. But critically, having the kind of the facility of this like front of house testing space allowed us to be much more hands-on than I guess you'd be able to do in many other instances. Mm-hmm. So in this case, we were struggling with the facade. We kind of had an ambition that the facade should reflect the cast iron tanks, but using things like cast iron was coming in ludicrously over budget. And so we kind of trying to find a way of making something that talked to that industrial heritage, but we could afford, basically. And so this kind of one-to-one mock-up was showing how we came up with a system that was based on fiber cement, so the type of thing that's often put on like, agricultural sheds and factories, but using it in a way with very few bespoke elements that transcended that kind of agricultureness, staining it, coloring it, that we then delivered as a package. So we actually made the components in our own warehouse, in our own studios, that then were delivered on site. And so enabled us to kind of create a very economic, affordable, kind of crafted element on a building with a budget that normally wouldn't allow that type of approach. And that kind of applied to a whole bunch of materials across the site. So the facade was one big one, but equally we made stains for the timber out of iron acetate, which is basically like wire wool you dissolve in vinegar and creates this beautiful grey stain. We made tiles and ceramics. And so it was the idea of, like, I guess, exploring, even within quite a traditional architectural commission, how you could bring these elements of craft, these elements of like testing, and these elements of kind of self-build and self-initiation into like something that was much more trad.
Yep. Yeah, no, I mean, this idea of craft sort of is the common thread that you find throughout your projects, and also like the idea of being economic when it comes to designing and not like doing too much sometimes. But another aspect of your projects that I find interesting is the idea of locality and sort of designing with the local context very much in mind. And I was just wondering if you can expand on that, and also in the idea of like being an international practice but still working with a local perspective and doing sort of, what for you globally thinking but locally, but local architecture looks like.
Yeah, so I mean, the next set of projects is kind of like an ongoing work, which I think it kind of talks to all these different elements and their its entirety. So it's a set of projects called the 𝗁𝗵𝗆 Streets, which it's an area of Liverpool that was very prosperous in the beginning of the 20th century. It was tied to the docks, and the docks had developed. It was one of the first like multicultural areas in the UK and in Europe. Because of the docks, it kind of had people from all around the world, a very big Somali population, big South African population. But I guess in common with lots of post-industrial cities, suffered a kind of fairly precipitous decline. And the kind of solution that was proposed, and what these two maps show, was basically demolition of the existing housing, rebuilding at lower density. Somehow that would bring the market up. And so what you see here is the map is on the 1950s, the kind of original street grid with Granbury Street running down the middle with this kind of really vibrant high street, to what we saw in 2013, where only 4 streets are remaining. That's why it's the 𝗁𝗵𝗆 Streets. Yep. And the real problem was that you replace an area that had real material culture, real value, real heritage, and also real community kind of infrastructure existing within it, with kind of very nondescript, very soulless, like suburban developments with nothing else but housing as well. So there's no shops, there's no cafes, there's no pubs. In a way that actually the local council kind of had to do a bit of a 𝗫𝗀𝗆 later and be like, actually that was a bit of a fuck up. We created the situation, and actually we've left it worse. We've moved people away from their homes, and we've replaced it with nothing. And then so we were brought this into the area by a woman called Xanthi Hamilton, who was working with this group of residents who'd refused to move out of these 4 streets. And at the time had sort of taken matters into their own hands. They'd sort of started painting the empty streets to make them feel less hostile and less kind of oppressive. They started gardening the streets, and that was a kind of hugely important thing, like that little kind of act of rebellion. Kind of lots of murals. They started organizing street markets. So this is much later. This is only a couple of years ago, and kind of built into kind of quite a big bi-monthly event. And we met them kind of just at this moment where they'd kind of gained enough credibility in the eyes of the council. They were negotiating being transferred, originally 10, but then that moved up to 15, and now it's kind of still growing houses. So kind of as a test bed to try and see what they could do. And this is partly also the council who had run out of money and didn't know what to do with these houses. They had no more ideas. Yeah. And so we started, and I guess what the residents say why they really enjoyed working with us is that we started, rather than coming with an idea about, okay, we're going to demolish everything, going to start again, we're going to knock it all down and rebuild, we started a process of really carefully talking and listening to them and understanding from their perspective what was really valuable about the area, but also what was challenging, what was problematic, and created this sort of, I guess, quite like wide-ranging, but quite, what's the word one? Like opportunistic master plan that identified a range of different sites, a range of opportunities that you could slowly develop over time. And so rather than needing 5 million, 10 million pounds of investment and you start again, that you could actually slowly chip away at the area and over time kind of redevelop it in a way that also didn't require wholesale removal of people, didn't require people having to leave their homes. It's not dissimilar to the 𝗁𝗏𝗆 solution with the tower, where you try and keep people in situ as much as possible. And the first project with that was, I guess, restoring 10 houses on the street. And they were in kind of varying states of disrepair. This is a kind of fairly typical example where you can see the roof has fallen in, the scaffold's holding it up.
Yep.
And with very low budgets, sort of about £60,000 to £70,000 per house, was about carefully bringing them back into use, and then using the money really carefully to put in kind of a few moments of real specialness. So careful things like color. I think someone jumped out of stage. Yeah, careful things like color. And then through being embedded in the site, enable us to kind of be much more, I guess, similarly like kind of forensic in our approach to it. And this sign was something that really struck us, which is, all items of value have been removed from the property. And I guess for us, it's like that's also quite depressing. It's like you're talking about someone's home, and the first thing they've done is strip out anything of any kind of care. Yeah. And so as a key part of that project was this thing about how you reserved about 5% of the budget for these things we called enhancements. And kind of most emblematically being the kind of fireplaces that were, so each new house had a kind of terrazzo Granby rock fireplace that this kind of phoenix-like rebirth of the house. And what I really like about this series of photos, it shows that even people who've come in and completely changed the style of their house, these kind of fireplaces remain. And I think for me personally, like this image is like a success. It's like people who ultimately it's like you disappear, someone else has moved in and they've made it their own home. And then this kind of package of work evolved into what became Granby Workshop. And so at this moment we were nominated for the Turner Prize, which is I guess one of the most prestigious art prizes in the UK.
And you were the first architecture studio.
First architecture and first collective.
Right? Yeah.
And so we were like, well, we had a long kind of conversation about what we could do, and we were like, well, we're not artists as such. We're also not like ethnographers. If we try and tell the story in the gallery, that will just come across probably quite patronizing. Yep. We'll do it badly, right? It's like, it's not what we do well. And so we're like, well, actually what we should do is we should kind of try and continue the project. And so we came up with this idea that taking these kind of products and items that had been designed for the house in Granby, setting up a workshop that could produce them in Granby, that they could then be sold at the Turner Prize exhibition, and then that money would come back into Granby. And so you're kind of creating a kind of economic activity within the area. And so created these, developed this into a series of objects that, I mean, some of these ideas aren't very new. They're very much arts and craft ideas about things that could be mass-produced, but that through mass production would exhibit the kind of mark of the maker. So kind of a series of different projects here. Kind of set up the workshop in one of the empty buildings on the area. And now it's a kind of ongoing business. Again, another example of a business that it's now an employee-owned company that we have a seat on the board, and the CLT also have a seat on the board. It recently launched it's now working predominantly with completely recycled ceramic bodies, so recycled clay. And so, yeah, I mean, COVID was really hard for it. It had a bit of but it's sort of emerging and now kind of coming back into strength. And has been like a real amazing source of ongoing collaboration. So often when we have projects, we'll look to talk to using Granby within those projects.
Yeah. And it's still running as...
Still running, yeah. It's still running. There's 5 employees. It's moved site to a bigger site. Still in the area. Still very local. Still with the same... I mean, someone from Assemble ended up moving to Liverpool to set up, and is now doing a PhD in ceramics and clay bodies as a result. So he's kind of still associated with Assemble, but kind of doing as a result of this project, has gone a completely different path. It's he's finishing up his PhD at the moment, based in Liverpool, specifically around recycled clays and recycled clay bodies.
Wow.
And then the kind of final project within Liverpool I talked to is the Winter Garden.
Right.
And I guess it's an example of, so you've got the housing, you've got kind of work, and I guess an idea about that, a functioning neighborhood needs a mix of uses and mix of functions. And if you think about the neighbors you like the most, they're often ones that combine housing, they can bring on work, they can combine socializing. And so we had this idea, and this was a kind of complete this particular image was a kind of fantasy image of a kind of public garden within one of the kind of burnt out houses. And again, through the attention of the Turner Prize, we talked to the CL team. We'll do 10 days of work without any fee, and we'll kind of put together a funding package and look to get funding for it. And took 2 houses on the street and proposed essentially like a community centre for the area, but a community centre that was built around this kind of garden in the house. So turning that kind of initial like fantasy into something that could exist in 2 real buildings. And that opened in 2019. Again, then shut again because of COVID. And then reopened again in 2022. And it provides this kind of, I guess, again, the budget was about £250,000, but provides this kind of public heart to the street. So that these 2 houses, they're right in the middle of the street. It hosts events, it hosts their meetings, it hosts kids' parties, but also it's a place that people can just come to. Working with 𝗏𝗲𝗍 Workshop, so they developed new tiles for the shower room, and then it was one of the first spaces that used the tiles that were developed for the Venice Biennale. And what's quite nice about I like the project is, again, it's like it works very closely within the existing fabric. Like from the outside, you hardly notice that there's anything odd about the house. You have to look at the roof to realize something's a bit up.
Yeah.
But if you get close, you suddenly realize that there's plants in the windows, and there's no floors, and it's this kind of discovery, and it feels very much of something that belongs to the area and is of the area and belongs to the people. Yeah.
I mean, I think this idea of making residents this agents of change in the neighborhood, and of like participating in actually like making the neighborhood within urban developments is very interesting, because usually you associate redevelopments with, of course, housing, but then probably more of a consumption-based model, so like stores and bars and cafes and where.
And I guess for us, it's also about it being shared. So, like, I mean, I could talk a lot about this project. It's like, but so like all the houses are, half of them are rented, half of them are sold. The ones that are sold with a legal caveat that means that the value of the house can only rise by the value of the median income of the area. And so there's a whole idea about like, it's trying to preserve a kind of communal collective ownership. And so for the ones that are kept in rental, that is a literal collective ownership. But even the ones that are sold off, it's trying to maintain and avoiding, I guess, the risks of redevelopment, which is that the people who are already there get forced out.
Yeah.
And like, I guess the gentrification is a very complicated conversation topic, but I guess this is an example of like, the area needed to be developed. It was, most of the houses were derelict, they were falling down. But how do you try and do that in a way that doesn't force people out? And completely worth saying, like, it's small, in the scale of development, but I think you have to start small to kind of prove that these things can hopefully grow in scale.
And it's a model that you can sort of scale.
And hopefully there's I mean, the kind of CLT movement in general is definitely growing.
Yeah.
I guess another project that does something very similar is Baltic Street Adventure Playground, this time with children, which is also really nice. And it started, again, a similar time, and you'll notice a lot of these projects are very slow. So like 𝗏𝗲𝗍 started in 2013, and we are starting to build another house. One other project is going on site in January, and there's a pipeline of 10 more.
Oh, wow.
But the money is very little, and so it happens very slowly and very gradually. But here, again, it was, we were invited, again, as a kind of art commission around the Commonwealth Games. And what we felt is this is an area that did not need a kind of sculpture or a kind of an art installation that was about looking at. It was an area that was incredibly deprived, and playgrounds look like this, which is extremely depressing. At the same time as like huge new stadiums are kind of crashing into the middle of the area. And I think for us as well, I guess particularly thinking about children, is like the lifespan of a child, like 5 years for a development is long for an adult. For a child, that's their whole childhood. And the idea you might have to wait 5 years before you see anything positive. And similarly, we've been reading a lot about kind of anarchy and the adventure playground movement, which kind of emerged out of the anarchist movement, but also emerged out of the war. Adventure playgrounds in some ways are kind of mimicking like bomb sites, and this kind of that while they were obviously hugely dangerous and signs of like real destruction, also provided like playgrounds and freedom that it was very unusual for children at that time. And kind of went on a series of visits to look at the kind of adventure playground movement in Britain and Germany, which is really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And found this site that had been promised would be developed as a playground, but the money had disappeared in extremely dubious, basically corruption.
Usually happens.
And so we're like, okay, well, we'll take the site, we'll bring some money, and we'll just open it with the least amount of infrastructure possible to be a playground. And this is a kind of soft opening we did in October. During the school holidays, we'd be like, look, kids, you're welcome here. We're going to hire 2 play workers. We're going to come down. We're going to bring outdoor clothing. We're going to bring mud. We're going to bring wood chip. We're going to bring stuff. And you can just come and see how it works. And again, it was this idea about very quickly, very immediately trying to do something on the site that talked about its future use. And then I think particularly with talking about working with children, also created a space that was outside of obvious interference from adults and provided this kind of state of exception.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is at the same time while doing the actual design work and the actual work to kind of create the kind of actual permanent playground. And then the playground itself opened, and really the kind of key architecture is a fence. And the reason why the fence is there is because legally you have to have a fence that's 1.8 meters high for it to be able to be an adventure playground in the UK.
Right.
And that's like a kind of health and safety kind of checklist. And then everything inside that was about like trying to create, like I said, this sort of space of exception that enabled children to play, and looking at what the barriers to children coming. So we've got a whole series of boots, because it's a very, like I said, it's a very deprived area. People don't have outdoor footwear. They'd come play, they get wet, they get shouted at by their parents because they're wet and muddy. So we have boots and coats on site. We very early on provided food. This is an area, it's a food desert. Have you heard that phrase before?
No.
So it's like an area that basically there's very little access to fresh fruit and vegetables.
Okay.
Like people go to the chippy for lunch.
Wow.
Like the play worker who, he admits his diet is terrible. His breakfast was a can of Coke and a white chocolate bar.
Oh
you know,
my
and so it's like,
Yeah.
so diet is really important. It's, Glasgow is one of the lowest life expectancies in the EU when we were in the EU. And still in Europe.
Geographically.
And like I said, it was this space that was about like the children coming together, taking ownership, and at the end of every day they could come together and talk about what's happened, and the children are allowed to kind of express their agency on the space, use tools, make stuff, and I think that's, again, it's like in some ways it's directly taking the thing that we saw so positive about our early work and kind of sharing it with others.
Yeah.
And similarly, this is now an independent charity. It's been running 5 years. It's a kind of also runs a food bank out of it. And it's a kind of funny project where it's like it's fundamentally not about aesthetics at all.
Yeah.
It is like the aesthetics are about the kind of chaos that children bring to a space, and about that joy, and about this kind of malleability. And it doesn't follow the kind of adult ideas of what should look good. And that's like the entire point of it. But it's like quite funny because it's like the design here is, you know, the fence is at the back there, and the landscaping, and it's all like infrastructure that is almost invisible and kind of needs to be invisible, and that's the kind of, and so it's quite funny in that way. But I think that's quite a kind of an extreme example of where like the program is everything.
Yeah.
And then did you want to? Then very briefly, I guess, like looking at a way that kind of exists in a kind of more formal, maybe more aesthetic way. We recently won a competition for the renovation of a market square in South London, very near where our studios were at the time, called the Blue, and it's a really like vibrant market, but had not been kind of touched in a long time. And similarly, we had the strategy of like, okay, look, we'll start by basically launching the market again, relaunching the market, getting traders excited before we do much design work, before we really like commit to things. Like, let's test out what's going to happen on site, and use that as a way of getting the community, or the communities in this sense, because there's like lots of overlapping communities, kind of excited about the prospect, but also as a way to be able to work out what works. So it's kind of a kind of reciprocal. It creates a reciprocal, and it's like I never like using the word co-design because it's not really co-design. But it is about conversation, and it's about being able to understand the people using it, the people who need it, what their needs are, and what their reflections are without showing them a drawing, which is like, I mean, like a musician doesn't show you sheet music and ask you to think, you know, because, and why should people be able to read drawings are incredibly abstract. And so I guess it's a very immediate way. And this is now opened as a kind of market that's open daily and then has kind of weekly kind of food markets. And so I guess it's as a more like permanent, like designed-led project, kind of showing a sort of similar approach.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also the way that you sort of use immediate materials and immediate resources in a way that creates meaningful results without really compromising anything. And another like aspect that I find very interesting in your work is sort of materiality and the idea of bioregional design. And I mean, taking from the definition of what sustainability is as defined by the UN as, you know, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future generations, without compromising future generations from meeting their own needs in the future. I wanted to sort of have your take on, you know, because this term has been like used and abused a lot in the recent years, like your take on sustainability and what it means for you to design sustainably today. Yeah,
I mean, I had this conversation with another, like, someone we founded with, Jane, and we got to the point we're quite like primitivists as architects, in that we're interested in the things being the things, and we think that for us sustainability comes from a kind of clarity and honesty in the materials and in the fabric, and a kind of not trying to rely on systems to kind of make a building efficient in a way, and relying on like the kind of physical infrastructure, and being very conscious about, I guess, sustainability in one sense, but also I guess about ecology. I think sustainability is also very, again, I personally don't like the word sustainability because it implies that what we're doing should be sustained in any particular way. And I guess for us, we like trying to think about ecologically, thinking like terrestrially. And so I guess a project that sort of talks to that quite a lot is a building that was opened last year for the 𝗲𝗲𝗲𝗏 Foundation in Arles, and for Atelier 𝗲𝗲𝗲. And so Atelier 𝗲𝗲𝗲 are a kind of research arm of the 𝗲𝗲𝗲 Foundation that looks at promoting, I guess they talk about like bioregional design. And so for them, that means like looking at the kind of territory you exist in and using that as a basis. And we were originally kind of approached for a mini competition between us and BC architects. And we talked to BC and said it'd be much more interesting if, should we like do it together? I think BC suggested it first. We're like, yeah, okay, we'll suggest that. So we came to the client, we're like, well, we don't really want to compete, but we do want to work together instead. And they were like, okay, all right. And so it became this like really nice organic relationship where us, BC, and 𝗲𝗲𝗲 Atelier were kind of like the three creatives behind the project. The 𝗲𝗲𝗲 Atelier also being the client, but they have their own kind of design knowledge, and kind of working quite intensely in residencies within 𝗲𝗲𝗲, working with big models. And this project was quite extreme because it was like an exemplar. They really wanted to push it. And so working on the idea of like looking at the territory around the site and what was available there to kind of look at opportunities for building. There was about 20 different materials that got developed during the course of the project, and then of that, like 3 or 4 actually turned into things that were usable. And some of this was research they were already doing in the atelier, and some of it is stuff that came out. So key one being kind of rice husks. It's a huge area of rice and sunflower husks growing in the area. Stone. It's a like very important quarries in France. And then, because they had this, essentially the site was this empty warehouse that would become the project, we were able to use this for like physical testing of a kind of this huge range of these materials and a kind of iterative process. So I'm going to talk about 3 kind of elements within that in a bit more detail. So the first was, I guess, a kind of earth plaster insulation build-up. And this was looking at, like I said, there's a huge amount of waste rice and sunflower kind of stalk, essentially straw. And so working with the atelier, we looked at ways of essentially making kind of compressed rice husks and using if you compress the rice husks with some of the sunflower, you get a kind of natural bioresin that forms within the sunflower, and using that kind of as a self-binder, and then gets kind of finished with an earth plaster. And again, this being kind of prototyped and iterated on site, and so over the course of the project, it kind of got better. And it's kind of, again, this is unlike, let's say, something like the project in Granby where the client needs the thing to work straight away. Here, there's an understanding that there's a risk involved in these materials, and so like they're not going to all be perfect, and that's kind of part of the project. And then, so like going from prototypes, cubes, to kind of panels, to whole walls, and kind of developing the process. And a lot of these are about also learning from like historic methods of building. And so I guess it's not ignoring technology, but it's also not ignoring the kind of past. And so they're kind of learning from the best of what we did previously, because we've actually got it wrong a lot of the time. So this is a kind of example of a kind of finished panel. Then BC architects, do you know of them?
Yeah,
They're kind of experts in like rammed earth and rammed earth construction. So it was a kind of whole process of looking at the kind of, this was largely focused on looking at the qualities of the dust that came out of the stoneworks, which kind of is almost like a natural binder. It's very fine dust. And looking at how that could be used directly, again, testing it in kind of large-scale models, kind of large-scale prototypes, and using this dust as a kind of binder that creates both. So there's a kind of series of different things going on here. On the back one, you can see they're kind of compressed blocks, and the front is a kind of more traditional rammed earth. And because this dust it's a limestone, so it kind of has some of the functions as lime, but without having to burn it. I mean, it doesn't bind. It does not bind in the same way that lime does, but it does calcify very gradually over time. And that was a kind of trying to think of understanding. And this examples of those kind of finished walls in situ, and then finally looking at like very like elemental timber construction. We use a lot. I think timber construction is something that we're very interested in. There's a lot of really good traditional joinery that you can learn from. And here, working again, the kind of experimenters here, we're working with the kind of sunflower oil and local kind of indigo production to create a sort of series of stains and paints and dyes that create this kind of gallery structure within the building. Again, working through kind of large models, working through one-to-one prototypes. And here, I guess the idea was the kind of no glue, so the thing can be disassembled, and like minimum mechanical fixings. So it's very expressive joinery within that. And then kind of here's that kind of completed space. And so this is their main workshop space. So the space before was a kind of foyer where their offices, and this one, so the rammed earth is kind of the offices, and the timber here is a kind of series of more kind of physical workshops, and this was for the opening, so they kind of turned it into a kind of exhibition space.
I actually visited the space in June, and it was very impressive to see how they are like experimenting with creating new materials all the time. And I guess somehow the building keeps changing through that, right? So they keep like adding or changing materials somehow, or developing new.
And like little details. So like all the handles were, the push plates are kind of covered in a kind of bioresin they were developing.
Right.
And so that was really, I mean, it was very fun as well for us, because you could literally like hot off like testing. You'd be like, well, what can we, because there's some things that they were kind of inventing materials, but they had no real idea of how they might be used. They're like kind of, because they're kind of playing in a way of finding these new things. And so like, that was quite really entertaining, really fun for us to be able to like literally, as materials being developed, be like, okay, well, how does this work? How could we use this? Can it be used structurally? Can it be used decoratively? And kind of playing with it. And this attitude even comes to the garden. This garden is quite fun, where it's each of these zones is a different geographic area, and it's plants they're bringing for like particular like functions, and it's all irrigated from the toilet flushing. So it's one of those toilets that has like separates urine and feces, and the urine goes to fertilize the plants. And so, like I said, it's a project that it's in itself. It's like it pushes everything to the furthest it can, and because it can do that. But I guess the idea is trying to then, for them, and we're conversating with them, how you can then take the ones that are most successful and how you start looking at a kind of mass audience. And again, for us, a lot of these aren't is not necessarily about everything having to be a total reinvention.
Yeah.
It's about how you start putting things together in a very careful, very considered way. And so an example of that is we're just finishing a completely different scale of project, but a private house in Devon where the client came to us with this kind of old, crumbling timber barn, and she was working on a kind of landscape rewilding project, and she'd seen Luma, and she's like, oh, well, like, how can you, I can't take the risk that Luma can, but how can you like bring some of that learning in that symbolically kind of works in this kind of site?
Yeah.
And so here again, it was like the resources available locally are the soil. It's Devon, so it's all clay, and timber. It's a lot of UK timber is grown there, and so we worked to create a house that's basically again from the area. We reuses the existing timber structure. It's insulated with wood fiber. Unfortunately, that's imported. The UK hasn't not. Hemp is just starting to grow. Like when we started the project, there was no real locally produced insulation material, but hemp is starting to be grown. And then like working very closely with like craftspeople and tradesmen. And so I guess a lot of this is also about not relying on things that can't be done locally. So the picture on the right is the two builders who are like a father and son team with a one-to-one mock-up of, so the cladding is all larch, but it's very thin profile larch that minimizes the amount of wastage. So you can use much more of the tree than you would from traditional milling because you're not trying to make big boards, you're making very small boards, and then even scrappy bits can kind of go in. So it's kind of this patchwork, and then the other one is a series of tests using clay from the land mixed with sand, and we kind of do a series of compositional analysis to create a kind of natural clay plaster, but directly. And so the idea here is like, how can you learn from these processes that they're not in themselves that difficult, but there's a lot of resistance to trying things out. And so for us, it's about documenting them so that other projects can then learn from them, use them, be like, look, we did it here, it worked. Actually, it's not that difficult. It's a bit more resource, but you save a lot of money because the material doesn't cost much. Yeah. And so the idea is creating this house that kind of feels very much like it exists of the landscape in the landscape, but is a very, like I said, very different in scale and very much smaller moment.
Yeah, still like showcasing this.
And has no concrete in the project.
I mean, I think there's this prejudice that when you don't use this kind of traditional materials, the building is not going to last, or you're going to have problems with the materials. And I think somehow these projects showcase how like you can overcome this concept, and also like. And
for us, also the internal environment. I think people forget that like having plastics and insulation, they're not good for the internal environment. Like lots of modern buildings, I don't know if it's the same in Greece, but in the UK, lots of modern housing have incredibly bad internal environments. They're damp, they're humid, they get mold, and so buildings like this, they breathe. The clay absorbs moisture. I mean, I'm sure lots of people are familiar with these other things. You know, as they're much healthier buildings to exist in. So they're better for the planet in terms of their embodied carbon. They're better in terms of the ecology of the materials in them, but also they're better for the people inhabiting them in that they're self-regulating. They stay cool in summer. They stay much warmer in winter. So they're kind of, for us, it's an important way of building because it's about, they make buildings that are very, very contextual. They very belong where they are. They also make buildings that are like healthy and for the world and healthy for the people in them.
Yeah. I mean, we've covered a lot of the architectural aspect, but as a studio, I know that you work across various scales and often blending art, design, as you showcased, also like other disciplines. And as a very multidisciplinary studio yourself, I was wondering if you can sort of walk us through the different scales that you work on, but also like what's the underlying thread that kind of connects them all. So
I think hopefully it's come out like, I guess craft is this kind of underlying thread. But yeah, like I said, I mean, our diversity is a strength and sometimes a weakness because sometimes people don't necessarily know what we do. So at the smaller scale, we do kind of furniture installations. This was a project for Clerkenwell Design Week that they wanted a kind of square filled with furniture, and we designed this kind of tessellating unit that was a very simple triangle, but you could put together in like hundreds of different ways to create your own little furniture. And it's a kind of, like I said, a very, very small, very short project. But it was about, I guess, again, this idea of craft, but also the idea of agency, this idea of like how people coming to the square could make space for themselves. And so it's a kind of little joke. Kind of jumping up a scale, a lot of our work, we do a lot of kind of exhibition and gallery design, and I guess for us it's also a way of testing ideas in a way that it's like you can test ideas in a way that you can't do in a full-scale project. So the 𝗞𝗲𝘆𝗍𝗲𝗁 playground was a commission through the Royal Institute of British Architects, and it was a project we worked with this photographer called 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗍𝗁, and looking at there's a kind of legacy of like 𝗞𝗲𝘆𝗍𝗲𝗁 playgrounds in kind of 𝗞𝗲𝘆𝗍𝗲 estates, and bringing those into the gallery, but making them in foam as a kind of, I guess, play on like safety and what our culture is about and play, but also just create something that's kind of joyful. And it's kind of amazing that when you sort of see adults like play, which is like very rare, but underpinned by an idea about like thinking of I guess for us at least these playgrounds, like they thought about how children kind of enter the public realm.
What material is this?
It's a recycled foam, so it's basically old sofas and offcuts and things like that. So like, and they chop it all down and stick it back together, and then when the project's finished, it gets chopped back down again and stuck back down again. So it's
very soft.
yeah, it's soft and squidgy. But you get in different layers, different amounts of squidginess. So you get hardness, you get kind of more squidgy, less squidgy. One of our more mad projects, which is just maybe thrown in as a bit for left field, was the Dream Machine, and this was based on an artist called Brian Gyson, who was linked to the Beat generation, who had an idea about how an observation that lots of like traditional medicine uses of like strobing lights can induce kind of mild hallucinations and transcendental effects, and trying to turn that into a collective experience. So it's kind of a spiritual, quasi-spiritual space. And then working very closely, I guess the feeling was that like this as a thing might feel quite unsettling and quite weird. You're kind of basically, and trying to turn that experience into a kind of collective, safe experience. So I did a lot of testing with the furniture, spent kind of hours of prototyping to get the kind of seat right, and that kind of created this kind of circular, oculus space that meant you were able to both have your own personal experience, but kind of always feel connected with other people. And that was a kind of touring show that was open in the 4 main capital cities of the UK. But we're looking at kind of new sites now. And this is a series of, one of the key things that came out, we asked people to draw their experiences like afterwards. And it was this kind of, I guess for people who've done like yoga or like some of these experiences are not unusual, but I guess for us what was really nice about this is people who'd never had any encounters with some of like these more like esoteric kind of cultures. And the drawings were extraordinary, like they basically gave people paper and crayons. And this is kind of growing archive. So yeah, it became like, it was quite interesting because obviously we were working very closely with like neuroscientists and kind of technologists, and there was a real kind of science experiment happening beyond this that's still ongoing. They call the perception census. But at the same time, so you have this kind of very serious science happening in the background, but at the same time there's this like pure joy of these kind of like little drawings and cultures. And this is a picture of the overall installation in it was an old ice rink in Edinburgh. And then at the kind of massive end of the scale is our biggest project, is a master plan for a whole industrial neighborhood in Canberra, Australia. And so this again is like trying, and it's a challenge, like how you like learn and how you bring some of those kind of attitudes literally half around the world. We had like a stamp on all the drawings to say like, remember, north is south, because all the ideas about where you design with the sun is all wrong. And this is a kind of ongoing project where, I guess, in this sense, trying to build very simple, very robust, very like dumb buildings that can live a long time and serve a lot of different uses as a kind of learning from the best of like industrial kind of architecture of the past. And this is the first buildings that are kind of due to start construction in February.
Okay, well. So I mean, sort of walking into the future here, I was wondering, how do you see your practice evolving, and what kind of plans do you have for the future? And
yeah, I think it's always really hard, and it changes, it changes all the time. But I think couple of things. We're really interested in, so our kind of studio has evolved in its own business, and so I think one of the key things we've been trying to do is, so we now have 3 sites across London, and one of the key things I think we're looking to do is to try and do our own developments and like learn from what we do and our own sites. And we were painfully close to buying a site in Bow that Liz Truss, the shortest PM in the UK history, tanked the UK economy briefly and meant that we couldn't afford to borrow the money to buy the site anymore. So I think that's one thing we're really interested in, and kind of this idea about like making space for creative and messy things in the city. I think we're really interested in like learning from the research and looking at like larger scales. So this is an ongoing project, a research project we're looking at in Bridport, which is a town in south of England. It's about trying to take these kind of themes that I've been talking to you about, developing locally, thinking terrestrially, and looking at like urban, like city or village scale, not city scale. And this is, I guess, in the context of, again, these are UK facts, but I think this applies in lots of the world that like most new build houses are flawed in the UK. Like 51% have major problems. Obviously, economically, they're terrible. You know, they have no idea about site. The same materials used everywhere. The ecology in the UK is probably one of the most ecologically damaged countries in the world. It's very densely populated. And so thinking about how an idea about construction that comes thinking like locally and terrestrially and also collaboratively. So these organizations we're talking to, so like Wessex Community Assets is like a kind of charity that looks to do kind of local development. The town council, Common Ground is a newly founded community land trust. How like you could look at like a different model of development that doesn't rely on a big company that comes in, does its thing, and moves away, and can be much more kind of collegiate in its approach, and learns, I guess, a kind of democratic approach. This is a kind of the arts and crafts. I guess is the last time it felt like this really happened in the UK. But also isn't trying to be nostalgic in its like form. It's about trying to think about how local industry, local materiality, and the kind of territory can be used to develop the housing. So not relying on importing materials a far distance and thinking how those things can happen with modern technology, but in materials that respect the ecology of a place. And this is the site. So it is due to be developed, I think, something like 700 homes. And there's kind of an ongoing discussion about how some area of the site may be given to this kind of CLT as a kind of test bed. So we kind of produced a kind of series of like initial designs and initial approaches about how like essentially like largely could be off-site fabricated, kind of different ways of construction could be used as a way of housing that could compete with the speed and the economy of mass house building, could still be done in a kind of ecologically and culturally kind of sustainable way. So that's the kind of, I guess a project that really, a way of thinking and a kind of scale of thinking that really excites us. And then what was I going to say? And I guess we still really love these kind of embedded, slow projects. So House 𝗦𝗽𝗲, I think it's the final thing we had on this one, but is it's an old Georgian terrace house in central London, in East London, that was owned by this artist called 𝗦𝗽𝗲, who kind of lived here for 30 years by herself as a kind of hermit, and the foundation that owns it doesn't really know what to do with it, and so working with them, we came with a proposal that it could be a centre for like land justice. So it's providing kind of free or very cheap space to a series of organisations to get land justice, kind of runs events, runs shows around the kind of idea about access, and that we're kind of, again, is an example of we're setting up a new charity that occupies it and runs it. We're looking at fundraising. We need about 5 million to kind of restore it properly, to bring it into public use. And then finally, kind of as a practice, it's interesting, like the founders are getting a bit older. We're having kids. But we're also thinking, I guess, as an organization, how the new generation, so we still have a kind of flat hierarchy. We haven't really spoken about our structure much. We still have a kind of flat hierarchy. Anyone who joins, if they still with us 2 years later, is eligible to join the partnership. And so now in a position where our first employees 5, 6 years ago have now been partners for 4 years and are taking on some of the control on their self. And so, I mean, it's a kind of slightly funny photo, but I think for us it's also about how, like, Assemble is a project and how we kind of hold on to some of those kind of, I guess, collaborative and kind of, I guess, yeah, collaborative and collective roots. So yeah, I think that's so like how Assemble as a project is also evolving within that.
Yeah, I guess it's this idea of participation, collaboration is embedded in everything that you do, from the projects to the way the studio works, and I think that's very cool.
So I stuck, yeah, everyone wondering, I stuck this video because I think it's really nice. This is a clip from a project we did called the Voice of the Children, which filmed playgrounds around the world. It was exhibited at the Venice Biennale. And this is the playground I showed you earlier, Baltic Street, and this was called the Bridge of Death that the kids built. But I guess for us it's in a very, like, it's a kind of metaphoric in some ways of, like, some of the things we've been talking about. It's completely self-generated by the children. This is not being helped by any of the kind of play workers. It's using the stuff they have available to them, and it's like their kind of agency. And I just think it's a really kind of sweet, and nice thing to end on in some ways. That talks, I guess, a lot about what we think is really valuable in the built environment. Admittedly, kind of aesthetically very different to lots of things, but I think that's the point. Is, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much for all the insights. Maybe we can open the floor to questions if someone has anything to ask.
Can't really see people.
Hello.
The lights.
Yeah, it's a little bit like.
Hi. So my question revolves around mostly the approach that you have towards the community and.
Do you mind putting the mic a bit closer with the noise? Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
So my question revolves around how you get the community engaged into the projects that you take on, and being in Athens and being in an urban city that has gone through massive change over the recent years in terms of, neighborhoods have been lost and have been commercialized. What's your advice on getting the people, because we have a lot of empty buildings, a lot of buildings deteriorating. How would you go on about getting communities involved and the people owning those buildings that are left basically to demise, and getting them sort of up and running again for the community and for the people in the neighborhoods to create this sort of environment again?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, in some ways, a lot of our role in something like 𝗏𝗲𝗿 was about trying to. So I think the first thing is, like, I think as an architect or as a designer, you can't create the communities that are going to do that. I think it always is about, like, working with and finding and really closely collaborating with people already on the ground. And for us, then I guess it's about trying to really understand about who's there, what they're doing, what their needs are, and then a lot of it has been about trying to then turn through kind of the process, trying to, like, represent and document and turn those ideas into something that like in this, let's say a building owner might understand. Whereas, like, they won't understand a kind of series of loose ideas, but if you create a document or a booklet that is like, this is how much it will cost, this is what we think we'll do, this is who's going to operate it, it then feels a lot realer. And so both, like, the House of Veneta I just showed, or 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, a lot of the project was, or Black Horse Workshop was about, like, turning maybe kind of slightly more ad hoc, loose ideas and trying to turn them into a form that the people who either own the land or make the decisions, or the councils, could, like, understand and could be funded. And that is, like, I guess, a collaboration between, like, us, often it's also with, like, ecologists, economists, and, like, business developers, and with the kind of groups themselves, and using that as a way of, like, essentially selling the project as an idea. And I think, especially with, like, buildings that are empty or derelict, that argument can be quite persuasive. You're like, you've got a building it's a liability, you don't know what to do with it. We'll take it off your hands. We're going to raise money, but it's hard. Like, it's worth saying, like, we acknowledge that these things are all really small in the scale of development, and we are functioning in a kind of economic and socio-political environment that has a lot of headwinds against this type of thing. And so, like, I'm optimistic and also, like, very cynical, if that makes sense. You know, I think these things are hard and they often don't work and they often go wrong. But the answer is still, I think, the way you still have to try, and the way of doing that is this kind of collegiate coming together, trying to document and trying to, I guess, solidify what the aim is in a way that you can start engaging with the more traditional and kind of way of doing things.
I guess somehow your role is also that of a translator or a mediator between like the needs of a community and the people who need to hear it, but in a more like organized, in a more substantial way than just voices around the neighborhood that are kind of raising concerns but don't know what to do with them. So
yeah, and I guess it's trying to find like that like different and those kind of networks are different in different projects, but trying to understand what those different people are able to do and what they're not able to do and what your role is, and like I said, it's like you know, trying to collate all the different parts. Yeah. And so I mean, even the Bridport project, like these different groups all have different functions within these projects, and and sometimes we're like leading, sometimes we're secondary, and I think we're quite comfortable in like either role. And it's I think coordination, and it is. I mean, architects are coordinators. In design, I remember when I was studying, like, you're never the expert pretty much on anything in a building. The engineer will know more about the structure, the M&E person will know more about the environment, most of the contractors will know more about the materials that they're doing. You, the person who knows how everything comes together, and I think in some ways it's the same idea, but also thinking programmatically and economically.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi. Just a quick question on the creative process in the studio, like all these mediums that you guys use, the more creative part of design. Many of us offices that we work at as young professionals don't have that part. What is your advice for us young professionals? How can we explore that part of what you guys do?
By medium, do you mean things like the modeling or the materials, or? I mean, I think you can do it at any scale, I guess. Like we had the kind of fortune or the serendipity or however you want to talk about being given that space, but you can do things at a smaller scale. I think a lot of it is also about, I'd be like, find craftspeople, find people who are again, like I said, we're not the expert in any of these things. Almost always they're people we're working very closely with who know more about us. So I think I'd say, like, if you don't have the space, find people you're interested in. So if you're really interested in working with timber or really interested in working in ceramics, find those people and like go to learn from them. And I think that that's always our approach to lots of these things. And I think especially when you're young, you have the benefit of time. You can. I mean, I'm getting older. I can't work as many hours. I can't, but like when we were younger, a lot of it was just about like we just because we were passionate about it, we just threw time at things. And I guess an interesting tradition, actually, in some ways, as getting older, is how we maintain some of those things while at the same time like finishing in time to go home to the kids, and like that has a difference. But I think, so my advice was like partner, find people who have the resources, have the skills, but in a way that is mutually beneficial. You want to make sure that you're offering something in return, and also never think that too small a space is. You can always do something even in a small space, and I think that a lot of it, I think, is it's about like attitude as much as it is about anything else. Yeah.
And I mean, what you've showcased in a lot of projects is also like this idea of repurposing or reusing whatever is available around you instead of like going to buy the most expensive glass or the most expensive stone. Is also like a method of kind of economically producing works that have value still. And
a lot of that came not through like a particular desire it became because we didn't have the resources. The reason why we use scaffold boards on the Cinerolium wasn't because we thought scaffold boards were great. They're an absolute pain to work with. You have to take all those metal bits out. They cut your hands up. But it's cheap because they have to be thrown away. They can't get used as scaffold more than a certain number of times. They have to be thrown away, so they were cheap timber. And it's I guess sometimes it's about exactly what you said. Rather than thinking spend less time worrying about things you don't have and more time about what the things you do have and what opportunities they are. It is hard. I wouldn't say it's easy or simple or it is hard.
Thank you. Any more questions? No? I guess we can sort of close it off here then. Thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you to everyone who listened.
Thank you.